Well, my name is Neil Goldberg, legislative analyst from Maine Municipal Association. I've also been taking the lead on a lot of these Arpa conversations, American Rescue Plan Act. And while I've done this a few times, I still get nervous every time. So apologies if I stumble a bit. But everyone is in a very different spot, I guess, in planning, accessing these funds, kind of understanding the rules around them. And so I'm going to go through relatively quickly, but please stop me if anyone has questions. Put it into the chat. I'm not able to see that, and so Jen, if you wouldn't mind just getting a word in, I'm happy to go back, and then I'll stick around to the end of the meeting today, and happy to answer some conversation. So, with all that said, let's begin. The American Rescue Plan. First, at MMA, I am not the only one working on this. There is a whole team of people, including some of my colleagues in the State and Federal Relations Department, as well as our Legal Services Department. And right now, I should put a shout out to them and say, if you have specific questions regarding your community and eligible uses, I would reach out to them. That's legal@memun.org, and they're going to be able to give you a much better letter of the law explanation of why something is or is not eligible. I'm able to kind of give broader guidance, but I want to just again mention that legal@memun.org is there to help answer some of these questions. It's not just myself at MMA. So what we will briefly talk about today is the ARPA 101 agenda. What is ARPA? What is an NAU? Some definitions. What guidance is available? So after this presentation, where can you go to find some good information? The timeline of these funds, which did recently change. I hope everyone got that notice. Great news there. How to request funds. If you haven't, that deadline is approaching. So we'll talk about that. What's involved in reporting? More on that to come. We're kind of holding our breath from Treasury. And then finally, what everyone wants to know, what are the eligible uses? So what is ARPA? ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act, is actually much broader than what we're talking about today. In reality, what we're talking about is the state and local fiscal recovery funds, a piece of ARPA. But for our purposes and going forward, we're going to refer to these funds as ARPA funds. And they are a once-in-a-generation injection of capital into all levels of government in order to respond to the COVID-19 public health emergency and its economic impacts. And it's important to know that these dollars are meant to respond to impacts of COVID-19. So as we're planning our eligible uses and projects or programs, we need to always think, how is this connected to the pandemic? Now that is very broad. The pandemic impacted us and our communities across so many ways. How we work, how we recreate, how we access healthcare, how our children go to school, and where we live. So there are really many, many impacts of the pandemic. And so addressing them should actually be quite easy as we start to think creatively. Now, I say this came to all levels of government. Here in the state, we received about $1.5 billion. About $1 billion went to the state, $261 million to our 16 counties. About $118 million for our 6 metro cities of Auburn, Bangor, Biddeford, Lewiston, Portland, and South Portland. And then $119 million for our NEUs. NEUs are non-entitlement units of local government. Everyone I'm presenting to today is an NEU. And these are communities typically serving populations of less than 50,000. The numbers that I just read, the 119 million, say for NEUs, is going to be divided into 2 tranches. You'll receive half this year and you'll receive half next year. I should put out right now that these funds are almost like a reverse grant program. There's been some confusion about getting spending plans approved or projects kind of vetted before receiving this money. But in fact, this is a grant program in reverse. First, you will receive your funds, spend them, and then report on how it's funded. That is a little bit scary because that means that there's a little room for error in the event that these funds are misappropriated. But it also means that no one's really looking over your shoulder. So if you are going forward with the highest and best use of these funds and you have some community input, you can be generally reassured that everything is going to be fine with how you spend them. So what guidance is available? How can you find out what is eligible or where to go to for other resource? Well, first you can go to MMA's Arpa webpage, where we are hosting what we believe to be some of the best and most updated resources. Quick run through of some of them. There's the U.S. Treasury's Quick Reference Guide. This is a great resource for giving someone a crash course. It's 2 pages long. There's some infographics of really introducing them. If you're making a presentation to your select board or you have a town hall meeting and people want some general, well, what is ARPA? That's a great resource. MMA has 2 FAQs up. There's a general one put up from the SFR department, as well as there's one from a legal service department. There's a 6/21 date there, but in fact, they actually just updated it about 2 weeks ago. I should have changed that. There's an eligible uses by expenditure list, which we'll see in a bit, but that's hosted on our website. U.S. Treasury has an FAQ up there. It's a little bit dense, but if you want to go directly to the source, they wrote the law. And then finally, there's a 151-page interim final rule. And I'm certainly not recommending anyone read this, but I put it up there as a reminder that this is still an interim final rule. We're waiting on the final guidance to come any day or any month. So Treasury kind of wrote an interim guide, put it out there, started sending money out and said, roll with it until we give you more definitive details. And as I will discuss in a moment, some things are changing. There are some drastic changes happening. As for upcoming events, I'll put some plugs in there. Well, we are having a regional forum today with Washington County. Thank you, SCEC, for organizing this. There are some topical forums coming up as well. Later this week is our housing forum. I will go in depth more in just a moment there. We have a telehealth forum that's being co-hosted with Northern Light, and that's looking at the intersection between broadband access and telehealth services, really focusing on the middle mile connections. Those are homes with fast enough speeds or maybe have access, but it maybe isn't affordable access. So what can we do for them? There's a government finance officers webinar coming up on the 22nd. So your finance officers in town might want to consider attending that. There will be a lot of discussion about reporting and compliance. And then finally, MMA is still talking internally about how we will present more information on reporting and compliance. Fortunately, it looks like we have some more time to discuss that. So our housing forum coming up on Thursday. I hope all of you have seen this already. It's not too late to register. It is free. Registration is on our website. But this is a great way to start the conversation of what is a statewide issue. Housing, whether it be affordable housing, workforce housing, senior housing, it is a problem or an obstacle in a lot of our communities. And while these ARPA dollars may not be enough to accomplish all of our dreams, they might be enough to get the ball moving, to build some momentum in this field. And so we brought together what I believe to be some true industry experts, including individuals from Maine Housing, municipal official from Portland, from Avesta Housing, Hannah Pingree from the governor's office, to really talk about financing, development, creative zoning, as well as kind of statewide policy and advocacy, all surrounding housing. So hope to see you there. That is coming up on Thursday. What other guidance is available? Well, beyond myself, there's MMA and our ARPA team. I mentioned the legal services. National League of Cities, even if you're not a member, has some great resources and webinars posted. I would steer you there. U.S. Treasury for letter of the law. And finally, your municipal peers. This is one of those instances where you are not alone. Every one of your municipal neighbors is going through the same process, asking the same questions, trying to spend the same dollars with the same restrictions. And so I would truly encourage you to reach out to your neighbors and your peers and begin a conversation with them. They might have the answer to something that you're wondering. You might find opportunity to collaborate over shared services. And so don't forget about each other. You will be a great resource to each other. Finally, if after all of that, you still need a little bit more help, you can spend these dollars on administrative supports, meaning you could spend these dollars to hire a consultant or an advisor, whether that be legal or financial, as well as maybe a staffer or consultant company to help manage these dollars. We are seeing that already. We're seeing that across some counties. Aroostook County had a fantastic collaborative idea with its host municipalities, where they are sharing the salary of a ARPA coordinator. We're seeing some communities around the Sebago Lakes region do the same thing. So one opportunity there. Now, hiring someone isn't just someone who's going to manage your funds, but they also might have the time to go and chase grant dollars to maximize or match for joint projects. If that's something you're interested in, MMA does have a ARPA coordinator job description / RFP template for you to begin your search. That's hosted on our ARPA website. Finally, the last resource that I want to point out is the NLC Local Action Tracker. You can find it on our website, or you can just type in NLC Local Action Tracker. And this is a great way to kind of get some creative ideas generated. They are keeping track of basically every appropriation and spending of ARPA dollars. You can interact with this website. You can sort it by size, by state, by type of action. And what you're going to find is just how other communities across the nation are spending these dollars. Now, here in Maine, not many communities have really obligated many of their funds, but that's because Maine's a little bit behind elsewhere in the country. So there's a great way to get online and say, how is New Hampshire spending these dollars? How is Idaho spending these dollars? And you will get some good ideas, as well as maybe see that there are some broader uses here. So I really encourage you to check out this local action tracker. Okay, the timeline of ARPA funds, and this is for NEUs only, which is good. I think that's the entire crowd here, except for maybe Chris from the county. But for NEUs, they must register to receive the first half of funds by October 24th, just under 2 weeks. If you haven't done this and you've been trying and unsuccessful, please reach out to me after this meeting. I'd be happy to help get you going on that. But that is the first deadline approaching. Originally, the reporting deadline was at the end of this month, but after some public comments, Treasury has extended that. So NEUs will have to submit one annual report, a project expenditure report, each year, and that deadline is now April 30th, 2022. When you report, the reporting period will be from the date of your award, when you receive the funds, to March 31st, 2022. Originally, when the reporting deadline was at the end of this month, we figured there wasn't going to be much for NEUs to report. That was kind of a good thing. But now with the reporting deadline towards the end of April, there will be some stuff for municipalities to actually report. And we'll talk about what those things will be a little bit later. But March 30th, 2022, and annually thereafter is the reporting deadline. The other deadlines to keep in mind is the deadline to obligate funds, and that's the end of 2024. And then the deadline to expend the funds by 2026. So you have some time between 3 and 5 years to really get these conversations going, figure out what is the highest and best use of these dollars, and plan for eligible projects. So that could be one big project that you plan for over a year, or it could be many small projects and allocations over the next 3 to 5 years as the need arises. We have some communities saying, hey, we're just going to stash these funds and wait for something eligible to appear on our radar, and we'll have the money. We've got 3 years. In the meantime, you can put these funds in an interest-bearing account. Any money earned in that interest-bearing account is yours to use however you'd like. So waiting is one of those instances where you could actually earn yourself a few dollars. All right, moving forward. So if you're a community that hasn't requested funds, this is for you. I think I recorded every community here in attendance, and I think everyone has requested their funds. So this should be old hat, but if not, I will go through it. The state has contracted with a third party, that's Horn LLP, to manage the portal and disperse these funds. No one is really sure what Horn's role will be after the funds have been dispersed. We don't think they're going to stick around for the reporting period. But at the moment, Horn has been great. They've been relatively transparent. They've been communicative. Just today, we received an update of communities that still have yet to register. So they've been really great working with MMA and our members in hand. Now, with that said, they did create two email addresses that just kind of scream of spam. The first is main.arpasupport@hornllp.com. And the second is no-reply-outsystems@hornllp.com. These are real email addresses. So if you get anything from them, it is not spam. Check your spam box for emails from them. And specifically, the email for initial login information. Horn sent out direct communication, probably to the chair of the select board or the first select person, for initial login. And without that email, you can't get into their portal. So if you can't locate it, reach out to them or MMA to reach out to Horn on your behalf to locate that email and get you into the state's portal. It's open, the portal is open and open for another few weeks. There is a user guide. It's in these PowerPoint slides as well as on our website. When you go to register, you will need some basic information, a name of an authorized representative, contact person. You enter these DUNS number. That's a free of charge number you can get online. Takes about 30 minutes. Most communities already have one, as well as you'll need a tax ID number. You will also need to provide your total operating budget, which I will discuss in a moment. Some financial information, maybe the receiving bank institution, or you can request a paper fund, as well as a test to assurance of compliance and agree to the award terms and conditions. You can come back to this portal anytime to check the status of your request. If you see flagged for documentation as the status, that means you should probably reach out to Horn or MMA to get something resolved and get those funds in your accounts. Completed requests submitted before Wednesday will be processed by the following Monday. So if you get your request in before the end of tomorrow, you will receive your funds in 6 days on Monday. So a little bit on their timeline. Again, Horn has been great. They do have a 1-800 helpline as well. When reporting your total operating budget for this purpose, they define it as the most recent budget in effect as of January 27, 2020, which includes the operating and capital budgets, as well as the appropriations for school and county expenditure. This is a pretty all-encompassing budget line. For the purposes of requesting funds, you don't need any documentation, but come reporting in April, you will need to validate that somehow. If you can't, they will work on the honor system, but it's highly recommended that you submit some sort of audited financial report to confirm your total operating budget. At this point, I should probably say that Treasury wrote a one-size-fits-all program for the entire country. Every state is different. Maine feels it's very unique, and in some ways we are. So when it comes to this budget, for instance, Treasury is looking to capture the full picture across every community. So generally speaking, if there's a question of should we include it in our total operating budget, yes, do it. And we will come across another instance in just a moment of this one size fits all making it a little bit difficult for our main municipalities. So receiving and obligating the funds. So you've requested the funds, maybe the funds have actually landed in an account or you've received a paper check. Now what next? Again, one size fits all model. Treasury didn't plan for how different states across the country actually go about with their local government spending and obligating. So MMA is recommending that just because here in Maine, this is how we do things, that your municipality follow an established legislative procedure for approving the acceptance of grant funds, especially if you are receiving a subaward from another unit of government, like what happened in Waldo County, where every community received an additional $20,000 from the county. In these events, it is probably good to have town hall approval. And so while some communities are going to say, no, we have a special emergency warrant that allows us to spend federal grant dollars, or if there's a period of civil emergency, we don't need town hall approval. That very well may be true. Follow the advice of your local legal guidance or officers. But from MMA, we're saying, generally cover your backs and create a resolution or host a special town hall. From a practical standpoint, this means you're also going to get the most public input, which is actually a big part of these ARPA dollars. That goes back to what I've mentioned a few times, which is the highest and best use of these funds. Here's an example of how Falmouth went about, putting out a concept spending plan for their town residents to approve. This is hosted on MMA's website, as well as in the legal services FAQs, which I mentioned towards the beginning. They have some other stock language that you might want to consider using. Again, Treasury's guidance does not require this. This is a recommendation from MMA specific to our main communities. So we've requested the funds, we've received the funds, now we're even talking about obligating the funds. Well, eventually, we will have to do some reporting. And as I mentioned, the reporting deadline now April 30th, 2022. And it's the period between the award date all the way to the end of March. So some of the things that you will have to report in that report are the funded projects, the name, maybe the description of the project, how much has been obligated towards that project, and how much has been spent. Maybe you put forward $100,000 and have only spent $20,000 of that. The status, has it begun? Is it in planning? Is it complete, 50% complete? The project demographic distribution. And I should have put in parentheses, if known. So if you know who this is going to serve, maybe it's a particular age group or a area or section of your community. What is the demographic of this expenditure going to be? If you have any subawards, especially if they are subawards greater than $50,000, you need to report that. I'll talk a little bit more about subawards later. Again, another signed version of the civil rights compliance document. Programmatic data based on expense category. And here Treasury actually gives you what those details were. So for instance, if you were to do a small business economic assistance program, they're saying, well, hey, report on how many businesses did you give out assistance to? What was the amount of money you gave it out to and for what general purposes? So pretty basic information, and Treasury details that for you. Generally speaking, I'm looking at this, I think MMA is looking at this, like, these reports are not very technical. They will certainly require someone in your office to sit down for a few days, probably use Microsoft Word, and get this all typed up. But this isn't going to be information that you won't regularly come across in your planning. Finally, a little bit of NEU documentation. So that's going to be your total operating budgets. Again, a authorized representative, contact person, your tax ID number. Nothing too complicated there. Finally is this SAM.gov registration, which I heard Jen at the beginning say that there is someone who will be available to help get those registrations. I might now recommend holding off a little bit on that. We received note a week ago, the same day that the project expenditure reports were deadline, that NEUs will not have to use Treasury's national portal to submit their reports. They didn't say what NEUs will use, but that the ID.me or .gov portal will not be necessary for small communities, which means you may not need to supply a SAM.gov registration. Now that's still free of charge. It's still quite easy to obtain. It can take up to 3 weeks to process. But as of this moment, we don't know where you'll be going to submit your reports in April. Fingers crossed that it's with someone like a Horn portal that we're already a little bit comfortable using. So, all right. To the back end of this presentation, what are the eligible uses of these dollars? This is what everyone kind of wants to know. I'm going to talk about the categories at high level, 10,000 feet, and then I'll go a little bit more in depth into each category. So the first is to support the public health expenditure. These would be anything that funds COVID-19 mitigation efforts, medical expenses, behavioral health care, and certain public health and safety staff. Anything that is going to help you operate within our landscape now is an eligible expense in this category. Anything that would have helped you operate in the pandemic world months ago or a year and a half ago would have been eligible, as well as anything that would help you prepare for the next pandemic, fingers crossed it never comes, would be eligible in this category. I will say you can't reimburse yourself for past expenses. So if you spent $10,000 on PPE or on hardening, barriers in your office, you can't reimburse yourself for those expenses, unfortunately. The second category is address negative economic impacts caused by the public health emergency. And this is across the entire economy. This is on the very local level of our residents and households, our small businesses, impacted industries, and the entire public sector. It really is the economy broadly. And so many ways to fit eligible uses under there, and I'll come back and talk about that category soon. The third category is to replace lost public sector revenue. We thought this was going to be kind of the juiciest category. What was great about it is to the extent that your community had revenue loss, you could use that amount of dollars on basically any general government service. What we have found is for many smaller, more rural communities, they did not experience lost public sector revenue. This is not about comparing one section of your budget to another and saying, well, we lost money there, and so we can apply some money to that area. For instance, an enterprise fund that may have lost money for summer programming because Parks and Rec was closed. But what we're finding is that excise taxes, for instance, came in higher than expected and surpassed any revenue loss in other categories. Overall, budgets were pretty sound. The silver lining here is that communities fared fairly well through the pandemic. We also don't anticipate revenue loss to increase over the next few years. And that is another great thing. And that's because our governor has increased revenue sharing, K through 12 education funding. And so these things are probably going to make up for any continued revenue loss that communities experience. And we'll run through an example of how that works, how to calculate that in a moment. Premium pay for essential workers. These are supporting those that put themselves and their health at risk, front of line workers, as well as some in-person staff throughout the pandemic. The fifth category is investment in infrastructure, specifically water, sewer, and broadband. And finally, our administrative expenses, as I mentioned earlier, you can use these dollars to hire someone or to manage these funds. You can also transfer them to another unit of government, a nonprofit, or private entity. These are what we're calling subrecipients. And if you choose to give a sub-award to a subrecipient, the catch is that you are still responsible for how the money is spent, and it must be spent within the confines of these rules. So as you're gifting or lending money to other entities, just be wary or mindful that they are capable and responsible enough to spend within these guidelines. MMA does have a sub-recipient checklist on our website that'll help you maybe vet the experience or qualifications of one of your community partners as a recipient for these dollars. So to give one example here that kind of show how some of these buckets come together, I was speaking with a community not long ago about a beach erosion project. And under the letter of the law, beach erosion, environmental remediation does not fall into any of these categories. But as we were talking, we came across two great justifications. The first is in the public health expenditures. Well, they said, hey, if we repair this area of our beach, we'll have more area for social distancing. More people can be safely on the beach. Well, right there is a great way to say, hey, should there be another pandemic, we can host more outdoor recreation. So other projects that kind of fall into the same guise would be an additional baseball field or another basketball court. Outdoor recreation, generally speaking, falls into that. It doesn't seem it, but that is a public health response. Then we started thinking a bit more and said, well, this beach erosion project also would mitigate some of the negative economic impacts of the public health emergency. If there is more beachfront, then more tourists might come to the community, which tourism, hospitality was one of the impacted industries. And so there was this idea of economic impact coming to the community. Another project that's kind of piqued some interest in this area is some road repair. Road paving is again, not an explicitly eligible expense. But if there's a section of road in, say, a TIF district or your downtown that clearly would bring some positive economic value, then that becomes eligible under this category. So projects that aren't explicitly mentioned do become eligible when we think of what type of benefit or value they will bring when completed. So something to think about. All right, moving forward into a little bit more depth, the public health expenditures cover things like vaccination, testing, contact tracing, prevention in congregate settings. Those are work settings, those are recreation settings, those are housing settings, PPE, medical expenses, capital investment or physical plant changes to the public health facilities that respond to COVID-19. This is a pretty broad category, and you might find that some of your public buildings or facilities fall into this category. We're seeing things like HVAC and ventilation right there, additional bays in public works facilities or in EMS facilities. Some things that have been asked that I haven't really been able to justify are things like a roof. If you want to replace a roof on a building, we have yet to find any sort of explanation for why that would be eligible. So the line is very thin right there as to what is a kind of public health response versus just a wish list capital investment. Finally, I will mention mental health and substance use services are just a broad category that the federal government would love to see receive some funding from these ARPA dollars. And on the county level, we're seeing a lot of dollars flow into those two buckets. Okay. Negative economic impacts. Again, this is at all levels. This is at the local level for your residents, households, but this is also your small businesses, entire industries. And we're seeing some really great uses falling into this category. For instance, it could be direct cash assistance. It could be utility assistance, broadband rate assistance. One thing that we're seeing is some communities are paying or assisting in broadband fees, because what I've learned is that accessible broadband does not mean that it's affordable. Paying for modems and hardware so that residents aren't renting them would be another category in here. I would also say that if you are going to provide assistance to a disproportionately impacted community, those could be senior citizens, those could be children living in poverty, that generally speaking, the eligible uses for those demographics is very broad. If you do choose to do some sort of direct assistance program, we are recommending that you kind of create an application and some criteria, gather some information from the recipients, determine what the eligibility is, how much the award amounts will be based off of that criteria, and then finally to track the payments that are given out. This is just for your reporting purposes. Another interesting thing that we've seen fall into this bucket is a community-wide marketing and branding campaign. The idea there is that the branding and marketing will create some economic benefit that was hurt during the pandemic, especially in regards to attracting small businesses as well as tourists to the community. So a pretty wide category there, and a great one to help many of the people and businesses that struggled over the last year and a half. Premium pay. Premium pay is a way to assist the workers in the form of bonuses or raises. And you can do it in many ways. The first is to give $13 per hour in addition to the wages or remuneration already received. And this can be backwards looking. Can't reimburse yourself for previous expenses, but you can pay workers, eligible workers, for time committed during the pandemic. A few things. One, they must have worked in person. So if they were a remote worker, they don't qualify. And there must have been some sort of public health risk for their in-person work. So for instance, the plow truck driver who was by themselves in a cab plowing roads wasn't really at much of a public health risk and probably isn't eligible. But your town clerk or registrar that was forward facing would be eligible. The grocery store clerk would be eligible. So these dollars can come directly from you, or you can actually hand them off to a third party to pay for premium pay for workers. Disclaimer that you can only give up to $25,000 per worker through the lifetime of this program. It hasn't been an issue for many of our communities, but have to say that. We're also seeing that premium pay isn't really being calculated by hour, but is more along the lines of a bonus, whether it be a performance bonus or a hiring bonus. And it's basically if you worked full time the last year and a half, here's $5,000. If you work part time, here's $2,500. It's just administratively a little bit easier to calculate. If you are going to look back in time, you can look back to January 27, 2020, the start of the pandemic. Finally, some of the sectors included in here: healthcare, transportation, grocery and food, education and childcare, sanitation, public health and safety. It is not comprehensive. It's just some of the industries listed. All right, getting towards the end here. So revenue replacement, to the extent that you lost revenue through the pandemic, you can spend that quite broadly on government services. And I've listed those on the bottom half of this slide. When calculating general revenue, this includes revenue from taxes, current charges or fees, as well as any kind of miscellaneous revenue collected, and revenue from intergovernmental transfers. Again, we're talking holistically, one size fits all for the nation. So that's going to include state revenue sharing, any sort of transfer from the state or local government, not from the federal government. So your previous CARES Act dollars that you received would not fall into this revenue calculation. So I'm going to breeze through this slide and then get into an example. This is the general steps you would use to calculate revenue loss. But of real note is that last bit at the bottom, which is if you are a community whose fiscal calendar doesn't line up with the calendar year, the fiscal year doesn't line up with the calendar year, there's a bit of an administrative challenge in calculating revenue replacement. Treasury recognizes that. We're hopeful that this is one of the things that will change, that Treasury will come back and say, hey, you can align your fiscal year to the reporting year. And I'll show you why that's a bit of a pain right now. So this is a revenue loss example for communities that have fiscal years that end in June or begin in July, which is many of our communities. So this is Town X. We'll call them Town X, for example. And they have their base year, which is the last full fiscal year before the pandemic, ended in June of 2019. In that fiscal year, Town X had a revenue of $650,000. It has to figure out which growth adjustment to use. You can either use the real rate of growth in your community from the past 3 years, or you can use the 4.1% just given by the US Treasury. In most instances, 4.1% is quite generous. And that's going to be the one you go with. But you do get to create a growth adjustment between those two. Finally, how many months has it been? How many months has it been since the end of our fiscal year, June of 2019, to the first point in time? First point in time that we're calculating revenue for is December 31, 2020. You're going to do this same process every year on December 31, 2021, 2022, 2023. And so that number N will change by 12 every year. For the first point in time, it's 18, but then it'll go to 30, and then 42, and then 54. I don't want to confuse anyone too much, so for purposes today, N is 18. So determining the counterfactual revenue, the revenue you were expected to have had the pandemic not occurred, is actually pretty easy. And I have that formula up above. It's the base year revenue times 1 plus your growth rate raised to 18 over 12. No reason to really explain what that all means, but you follow that same formula, and what we find is that Town X should have generated $690,000 had the pandemic not occurred. Now, here's where it gets more difficult, is figuring out actual revenue. Now, we're trying to figure out the actual revenue for the calendar year of 2020, from January to December of 2020. For most of us here today, that's going to span 2 fiscal years, the back end of FY20 and the front end of FY21. So you actually need to break out 6-month intervals of your fiscal years. And you'll see that with the A and B and the C and D below. So in this example, we've broken that out for Town X. Therefore, the actual revenue is going to be B plus C, the first half of 2020 and the back half of 2020 in the 2 different fiscal years. Lastly, we're going to take our actual revenue minus the counterfactual revenue and determine if we had revenue loss. And in this particular example, it shows that yes, Town X had about $40,000 in revenue loss. So if you were a financial officer and you're in this meeting, this probably made a lot of sense to you. If it didn't make any sense, I'd be happy to go through it in more detail one-on-one. But generally speaking, we know that this is an administrative nightmare for our communities on fiscal years that don't align with calendar years. All right, wrapping up. Infrastructure. Two categories here. First, water and sewer. I will note that stormwater does fall into the water and sewer infrastructure. So those are a lot of your culverts that I know are on wish lists and bucket lists. But generally speaking, the way we've been told to explain this is if you have a project that meets the criteria of either the Clean Water State Revolving Fund or the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, then it is eligible under the ARPA program. And John True at Maine DEP has been really great at giving communities advice about if their projects fit into these categories. I would say Maine DEP is much more qualified to give you infrastructure-related water and sewer advice than I am here today. Broadband fits under here. Yes, you could do a physical network build out. That is a popular option, but for a lot of communities, they didn't receive enough money to actually start putting poles and wires around the community. But there are other uses here. Again, subscription rates of services, speed and network testing, hardware assistance, mapping, and then of course, physical network build out. If you do this, broadband related projects, the criteria are as follows. The ultimate project that must culminate in wired 100 over 100 megabyte per second upload and download speeds. That's very fast. Treasury knows that. In some rural areas, that second half, that 100 upload speed is almost unattainable. And if that's the case, then you have wiggle room in here. Treasury has put out some additional guidance for broadband project. Again, 100 over 100 should be the goal. Finally, the project needs to serve in part an underserved or unserved community as defined by receiving below 25 over 3 speeds. That's pretty slow. So if you choose to go down a broadband project, you need to provide at least one resident or business broadband that's receiving these slow 25 over 3 speeds. Finally, ineligible uses. There are a few ineligible uses. One would include depositing funds into a pension fund, using the funds as non-federal match for other federal programs. And then generally speaking, you cannot use these funds to directly service debt, satisfy a judgment or settlement, or contribute to a rainy day fund. And with that, I will wrap up. I hope I didn't bore or go too long, but thank you very much. Happy to answer some questions or stick around afterwards. I'm going to end the slideshow and we'll take it from there.
Here, we had one question, Neil, about whether or not your slide deck would be made available at the end of this session.
Yes, it will. I will send it, Jen, to you. And are you able to send it to the crowd?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll do that right after this, but yes, it will be available.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions for Neil right now?
Yeah, I have one, Jen. Would air exchanges be appropriate under the prevention for the town office and library?
I'm sorry, an air exchanger, is that like a filtration or ventilation product?
Correct.
Yes. Yeah. Air quality is a big one under here. We're seeing a lot of schools go through ventilation or projects. So yes, that would be eligible, especially because it's a public space.
Chris, did you have something?
Yeah, my good friend Ryan Pelletier at Aroostook County, I know, has looked at this, and I don't know if it's a bridge too far. It's not something we're looking at, but on the lost revenue, they were looking at trying to do an interesting calculation with lost growth rate in what they would have gotten in property taxes. In other words, if, taking the previous year's mill rate, assuming a 4.1% increase, and then trying to apply that 4.1 to the existing mill rate to say, if we had grown in such a way, this is the revenue that we would have gotten keeping a static mill rate. That seems to be a little, well, tricky, if you will, and I'm picking my words carefully, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I would not advise that any community do that.
Thank you.
There might be some rationale there, but it's certainly not letter of the law. And of all of the categories in the plan, revenue losses that Treasury will look at how those dollars are spent. And so to be very particular how you quantify it.
I figured as much, but well, if they want to try, I stand by and grab some popcorn and I'll watch, see how they make out.
Does anyone else have a question right now?
I have another one, Jan.
You bring up a good point.
Sorry, okay, go ahead, Louis.
Uh-huh.
Would add in police officers be an appropriate expense?
No. So police officers and EMS fit kind of broadly under these categories, whereas fire does not. Adding a police officer is probably going to fall under things like addressing the public health response. If they provide any of those mental health or substance use services, they could be justified under those expenses. So that would qualify. Is my audio coming through, by the way?
It is now. You have seized up just a little bit a couple of times, but you're doing fine right now.
Okay, sorry about that.
It was just a minor glitch. It wasn't terrible. I would have had you repeat otherwise. Thank you. Louis, does that answer your question?
Partly. I was looking at the county budget where
I am still
they're
here.
looking at adding 2 officers. But nowadays, law enforcement takes care of the mentally health and all of that other, so I almost think it would. Commissioner?
Well, the only thing I would caution against that, these are generational monies, once in a lifetime. And all we're going to do is, what are we going to do next year? Hope for another one of these to keep that same budget funding. Although it may be, I would not encourage that, because what it's doing is it's taking annual costs and trying to, just fill a hole with them for 1 year, literally kicking the can down the road.
So on that note, how about if we transition to Chris giving us a little bit of information about how the county is looking at the ARPA funds and what their perspective is on the use of the funding.
Thank you very much, Jen. I want to thank Neil for his presentation. I certainly don't have something to the depth and breadth that he had, and I had no idea there was going to be math on the test. But Neil, I took good notes, and hopefully I can figure all that out. From the county's perspective, we are a little bit different than the municipalities. And I don't want to bring politics into it, but it is a real part of all of this. But our lobbyist in DC, the National Association of Counties, was a very strong one. And we were able to get our funding released directly to us, and it doesn't go through any state screening or whatnot. So we are a little bit unique. And I will say that is to the chagrin at some at the state, so to speak. But our monies, we deal directly with Treasury on that. The other thing that's interesting about counties is what Neil said earlier about one size fits all. There are certainly way more rural counties in the United States than there are urban ones. However, the urban ones are the ones that really steer the boat, if you will, on that very powerful lobbyist group that I just mentioned to the National Association of Counties. So as a result, rural counties such as ours found ourselves in a little bit of a donut hole because, for instance, water and sewer and those type of infrastructure projects, if you will, well, rural counties such as ours, we don't have that. That's all done at the municipal level, if you will. So there was a real hole in how we could, quote unquote, spend this money. From the commissioner's standpoint, what we're looking to do, and I know that there have been certain communities and interest groups that have approached the commissioner saying, hey, we would like to, make application, if you will, for a couple of $1 million of your 6.5. And let me start with that and say that Washington County received about $6.5 million as our allocation under this program. So, and I know there's been a lot of good programs or projects that have been brought to us and ones that we would like to fund them all. But with only $6.5 million, it can go very, very quickly. So from the commissioner's standpoint, what we're trying to do is figure out what we can do with this quote unquote generational money and invest it in such a way that it continues to pay dividends well beyond the lifespan of any one of us that are on this call. Let's, make no mistake, our grandkids and great grandkids are going to be paying this money off well after we're dead and gone, so to speak. So the last thing we as commissioners wanted to do was have them pose the question, and forgive the euphemism, but what the hell did they spend all that money on? And if we get into what we as commissioners consider soft projects, so to speak, and where the money is kind of spent in a retail way, and there is no long-term investment made with the money, all we're going to do is enjoy the spoils on their backs later in life. So with that, the commissioners really have narrowed it down to a couple of different places where we think this money should or could go. That's not to say we've made any decisions as of yet, because we haven't had all proposals put before us, but this is where we're quote unquote leaning. From what is obvious on the page, broadband is something that everybody can agree is something that is desperately needed in rural counties such as ours. Connectivity to the rest of the world is huge. And, this pandemic, if nothing else, has given us a tremendous opportunity to make people realize that, rural living maybe isn't, as bad as they thought it was, years ago. People are fleeing the cities, so to speak. But the problem is that when they get out here, they realize their cell phone doesn't work and you can't stream Netflix. So as a result, they're not sure this is exactly everything they signed up for. So that broadband piece is something very interesting to us. However, as Neil mentioned, $6.5 million doesn't go very far when you actually get into stringing poles and wires and actually truly making the connection. So with that, we've broken that down into two subcategories: is how can we leverage that money to bring in more money? And number two, do we want to look at maybe on a wireless and a cellular type broadband that can help backbone some of this stuff more so than the actual, what people refer to as final mile? Leave that to the communities and, or most importantly, the private sector to solve. Now, with all of that comes the idea that also at the same time, the state has announced that they're going to have a considerable sum of money to fund some of these broadband projects, and they've taken an overarching interest in this. And under the infrastructure package that is being bantered about in DC, there is considerable money there for broadband. So with all of that, it begs this question. Do we want to quote unquote use our money, it's all our money, but do we want to use our local money for broadband when there's a project coming right down the road that is going to have money for broadband? And therefore, did we miss the boat, so to speak, on being able to do other things when somebody else was going to fund it? The second issue that we have with the broadband piece is, how do we pay a dividend on that? Washington County doesn't have, WashingtonCountyWireless.com. We're not in the business of wireless. I know there are some public consortiums. Callis has done kind of led the way in working with Baileyville and how to make that a public piece of infrastructure. But Washington County doesn't have that public piece of infrastructure. And let's say we invested it all in Callis, because Callis has a great network. They're up and going. Mike's ears perked up. He likes that idea. He thinks that's a hell of an idea. But the problem is somebody over in Addison is going to say, well, what does that do for me? Great for Callis, but what does that do for me? So that's the problem that the county has right now, is that in trying to find a broadband piece that would fit, we have to find something that everybody fits under the umbrella in the same and similar fashion, because everybody's a payer into the system. Everybody owns the business. Everybody should get an equal and like dividend. And the other piece of that is, if we go to the private sector to try to get that done, well, what's our dividend from the private sector? Let's say I take ABC Wireless or AT&T, or you pick it up, and we make an investment into them. We give them effectively $6.5 million of the people's money. In exchange, they get to send us a bill every month. Where's the dividend, so to speak, for the public investment? So, we're a little mindful of that we're just going to be giving, crony capitalism, so they speak, giving all this money to a private industry, and all they're going to do is, cut our rates for 3% for a year, and then the rates take off again, and they just forget all about the fact that we gave them $6.5 million. So you can see that broadband discussion is one that's very tricky, and it's something that we're wrestling with, if you will. So with that, what's the other option? This one wasn't as clean. In the beginning, it's something that at the Maine County Commissioners Association, which is where all the counties meet on a monthly basis, we all put this thought in very, very early. Some people called us crazy, but as time has gone on, it's coming back around, and Neil has mentioned, and that is infrastructure. The infrastructure piece, again, like I said, for rural counties, we can't do water, we can't do sewer, broadband's a tricky wicket. So where can we put things in infrastructure? Because infrastructure is really the key, ladies and gentlemen. Our kids and our grandkids and their grandkids, they're going to co-own, brick buildings or something. That's the thing that's of equal share to everyone. And 50 years from now, they can still go and touch it. So we've said from the beginning that we needed to put an infrastructure push in there, but we were always pushed back. It's water, it's sewer, it's broadband. So some of us early on said, but if we can find a way to tie it to the COVID response, then maybe that's something we can do. Again, in the beginning, people thought it was a bridge too far, but honestly now it's looking like, as Neil kind of mentioned, people are getting real creative on this. Our friends that work with the Treasury every day, and I will say this is my opinion, not that of the County Commissioners Association or even my Board of Commissioners. I think Treasury painted themselves a little bit in the corner on this. That one size fits all has made it so they've got all this money and now we nobody knows how to spend it. So I think they're going to give us a little more leeway. And with that, Washington County's other push that we're looking at, in a lot of counties across the state, all of our county offices, for the most part, exist in buildings that were built in the 1800s. They're all in the National Historic Registers. They all have slate roofs. They all have, 2-foot wide brick walls on the inside. There isn't a whole lot you can do to socially distance or be ready, quote unquote, for the next pandemic. So with that, and what we have found, especially through this last piece, the inadequacy of our public facilities at the county level, because we have been, shoehorned into these ownerships of these 200-year-old brick buildings, has really put perhaps what we think an opportunity in front of us. If we can take some of this money now and address the long-term building needs of some of our counties, i.e. new structures that are more modernized, that will allow us to deal with the public in a more socially distant fashion, be able to make sure we can continue to serve the public in a pandemic. For instance, the Washington County Sheriff's Office, to get to Lewis's point, on law enforcement, our Sheriff's Department is actually the remade over sheriff's quarters from the 1800s. It was a house. That's what it was. The brick building of the sheriff's office was the sheriff's quarters. When I was there in 96, when I started, we had 6 full-time officers, 2 of them worked remote. Now there's 15. And they're bumping into each other. Under COVID rules, they couldn't all be in the building at the same time, for crying out loud. So with that, the county is thinking that maybe we can take a long-term view and see what we can do in expanding some of our county buildings. Now that does 2 things. One, it addresses the COVID issues, but in the overall county benefit, these county issues are huge and are going to hit the county taxpayer at some point. Whether it's this money or other money, at some point in time, we have to deal with this. So if we can do it this way, in using this money at this time under these circumstances, not only can we address the issue, but we can also bend down the cost curve to the county taxpayer. Because going out into the future, instead of us going and saying, hey, ladies and gents, we fought it for as long as we could, but 6 years from now, we have to go to a county bond because we just can't do it anymore. We all saw when 2x4s went from $5 to 15, and now they've come all the way back down to 8, and we're celebrating. The longer we put off the build or addressing these issues, we're only driving our costs up. So now, if we look at it, we may be able to get this done now, avoid going to bonds later, and we can do it to not just to fix our problems, but to modernize our facilities. And I think based upon all of the issues that Neil has discussed and we have discussed internally amongst ourselves at the county level, we think it's a really good idea. So, I only want to put that out there because I want people to understand what the county is thinking and why we're so, we're a little different than the municipalities. And I know towns and cities are going to come to us and say, hey, we'd like a piece. And it's not that we wouldn't want to give a piece, but we have to find a way that we do something that everybody under that county umbrella, gets the same benefit. We can serve the same public and it can have the same long-term impact for each and every one of us. That's our thoughts, and I'll take questions.
Does anyone have an immediate question? If not, we'll go on to Mike and then kind of open it up to questions all the way around.
We have a question here, Jen.
Okay.
Hi. I'm wondering about use of some of these funds or the town's allocation for dam repair that we need in Whiting. It has to do with the Mill Pond Dam. That is a fire suppression water source for not only Whiting, but surrounding towns and the two unorganized territories that are adjacent. We provided over the years, there's been a lot of use of that water. But a well-known forest fire back in the mid-1980s. Probably we feel that the town averted, or the village averted, destruction by the use of the water in the pond. And I realize it's water. I'm not sure if that would come under the reference that's made for the use of these funds or not. It's something that would be, repair of the dam needs to be done in order to ensure this. And we're trying to work collaboratively with Down East Salmon Federation because they do want fish passage at that site. So I'm wondering about if there's any availability of funds, if that would qualify.
Kick that to you, Neil.
I'll jump in there. You know, on its base value, I don't think that would qualify. You hit on something towards the end about the Salmon Federation wanting to increase salmon population there, and thus there might be some economic value, there might be some recreational value, but short of that, I'm struggling to come up with an explanation or justification. So sorry.
Thank you.
But I will say one thing to that. I don't want Whiting to feel slighted. I would encourage Whiting town officials to reach out to our UT supervisor, Dean Preston, because the UT might have some availability to assist in that repair for all the reasons that you just said.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good, thank you, Chris and Neil. Mike, how about you?
Hi, well, thanks, Jen. I appreciate that. I am the city manager of Calais. I appreciate MMA and SCEC hosting this workshop today, and certainly appreciate you inviting me to take part and participate in it. I hate to disappoint everybody right off the bat, but I don't have the secret or the key to the key to the ARPA universe that I'm going to release here today. You know, I appreciate Neil being here. I've seen two presentations from Neil. Although he says he's nervous, he don't appear to be. When you give the presentation, I find those very informative and helpful. They certainly have helped us guide us along the way here in the city. You know, the big thing is I think everybody realizes here as we move forward in this process is you know, it's a very fluid situation. You know, I think Neil touched on everybody that's tuning in today, you know, is probably already registered and at least applied for some of these funds. That's good. I was going to say, if you haven't, why not? It's a pretty easy process. You know, certainly was for Calais, and just kudos to Horn LLP. They've been very helpful to kind of echo what Neil was talking about earlier. Just as an example, our finance director engaged with Horn because we wanted to shift over the primary contact, and just they were very helpful and eager to support in any way. So as Neil said, I hope they stay on board throughout the process and the reporting as well. You know, Calais is a non-entitlement unit in every sense of the word. So we'll say that as mentioned earlier. But the scope that we've in our preliminary discussions about what to use these funds for has been quite narrow, to be honest, so far. Neil covered the process, so I'm not really going to bore everybody with that again, other than the fact that that it was a pretty easy process. But you know, we've got some major water sewer infrastructure, or in particular, a major water sewer infrastructure project that has had, you know, approval from the folks. We've achieved bond anticipation notes for the sewer portion of that project. It's a pretty big one. It's a $4.3 million project. So although we did get some outstanding matching funds for that project, as you can imagine, with a project of that scope, there's some pretty hefty city obligations as well. So the first order of business, if you consider a lot of the discussions at our council level has been based on more project based, and that being a paramount one. We're supposed to start the project construction next spring. So that's kind of an obvious one for us in the city of Calais, is to kind of relieve that match burden that we have with some of these funds to improve our water quality in the city of Calais. We're going to be taking up a mile of water sewer lines that are the oldest within the city. So out of all the complaints that I field on a regular basis here in this office, probably 40 or 50% of them are water concerns, water quality concerns. So I'm excited to get that project going and underway, but these funds are going to go a long way in helping relieve that burden a bit. The other thing that's been discussed at our council level is we also have 2 water wells. That's how we deliver water to the folks. One of those wells, although it's not a major concern, is a little underperforming slightly. So we're kind of looking down the road at some things that we might run into. So we've investigated how much it'll cost to punch another well. This isn't like doing one in the backyard for $6,000. If it's a public water source, and you're talking a couple $100,000 here, and that doesn't have anything to do with the geo surveys that need to take place that are very expensive, and so on and so forth. So we've been throwing around the idea of using some funds for that. There's also some backup generators, so there's quite a cost to doing that, but again, that's improving the water supply for the city. So that has been discussed. And the third major thing, there were a few other smaller items that have been in the peripheral, but the third major thing that the council has discussed for the city of Calais and what they feel will best serve everybody. We've had an uptick in our elementary school enrollment. And they're running out of space in that school. And as Neil mentioned, anytime you can add more space and get people spread out is kind of a no-brainer when it comes to these funds. So we're looking at adding 4 classrooms and some office space in our elementary school. So that's in preliminary stages at this point. So they've certainly thrown the school board has certainly thrown their name in the ring on that to have us consider that. That's been discussed at the council level as well to help them with that project. Some of the peripheral things that, like I say, that's a pretty narrow scope, kind of no-brainer things that we have. And like I say, this council seems to be more project driven. But some of the other things that Commissioner Gardner spoke about, that middle mile for broadband, Calais and Baileyville has been well documented. We've had a lot of exposure about our Down East broadband utility, how that was formed. If you look at the structure of that, we've made the investment. Calais and Baileyville are already on the hook for that. There's really nothing that we would be receiving money from the county for that. I do disagree with Chris to one, if you consider the model when it comes to broadband and the outlying towns that could certainly become members of the DBU. That's kind of how this model is set up. There's an investment from those outlying communities to do a feasibility study. There's obviously some build out costs, to see how much those would cost. So those are things that we're encouraging the county to consider, giving those funds out to those surrounding communities, because the way the model is set up, that once the debt's paid, that's going to come back to these outlying communities, and it will be paid. We're very happy with the progress in the number of people that are signing on to the network. And so how this works, and I don't want to bore everybody because this is an ARPA workshop. It's not a broadband workshop, but just to touch on it, just to let everybody know out there, because I know there are other people tuning in that are in outlying callous communities here, that, you know, DBU secures the debt, whatever the build is going to be on the cost of the build for your fiber internet. DBU basically will take on that debt. The town is going to be required to secure it. And so God forbid if anything happened to the utility, that cost would be laid back on the taxpayer. Right now, this is based on ratepayers. It's not based on everybody in the town. Whoever is getting the service pays a fee every month, and part of that fee will come back to the DBU until the debt's paid. The best thing about this is moving forward. This is the piece I want to speak on to the commissioner, is that you can invest, you can give money to Spectrum, or you give money to Consolidated, and they're going to be able to choose what they want to do with it, how much they want to charge. If you give these funds to the outlying towns and they become members of the DBU, eventually when that debt's paid, that comes back to the community. I mean, we can use those resources to keep rates low, to keep, you know, improve the network, you know, whatever it is. It's a nonprofit. So that's what we're excited about so, you know, it will come back eventually. It doesn't just go to line the pockets of the big incumbents that are out there. So we have discussed some of that middle mile, as you like to call, Chris, final mile. You know, broadband is certainly something. We've also had fringe conversations about marketing, again, kind of based around the internet and our ability to provide. We've got the fastest internet in the world right here in Calais, Maine, in Billyville, Maine. We need to do a better job marketing that. I think that this has a lot to do with timing. You know, we're hoping post-pandemic that, you know, when we come out of this, we really want to market ourselves to attract younger, more people that can work from home, you know, because they can do the same thing as they can in an office in New York City right here in Calais, Maine, 04619, but yet we've got a better view. So, you know, that's what we're hoping to do. So there has been some discussion on marketing the city centered around the internet. And there was some discussion about frontline essential workers and bonuses, but you know, we're coming off a contract year. You know, we're entering into a new contract year. Just finished up one, and we've got 4 units in the city here, and 2 of those units we have settled on with significant increases in pay. We still haven't settled. We're about to enter into mediation with 2 other units, bargaining units. So it's kind of a sticky thing right now to get into when it comes to divvying up pay between the frontline essential workers. So, but again, kind of goes back to the fluidity of this whole thing. Everything's on the table as far as Calais is concerned right now, and that might be something we'll explore once we get these contracts buttoned up, which I hope is sooner than later. But that really is all. I know it's all in a early stages of this. We're trying to keep an open mind, watching the guidance come through. I certainly appreciate everything that MMA is doing to do that. It's just a awesome resource. You just go on their website and everything you'd ever want to know. Every update is right there. They kind of hold your hand through the whole thing. So I appreciate the time, and thanks, Jen, for letting me speak here today.
I appreciate you participating, Mike. Thank you very much. Yes, Chris.
Yeah, I just want to kind of piggyback on what Mike said. Mike, I hope you didn't take it the wrong way, is the fact that just the county's not in that business, and the fact that we don't have a utility set up. And that if you took our $6.5 million and divided it equally amongst all the 44 different fiefdoms here in Washington County, effectively, it is the number that you as your municipality has already gotten. If you look at the allocation that was given to Washington County and you add up all the allocations to the cities, they're very, very similar numbers. So I would encourage any of these communities to look at that community broadband approach, because I think it's you know, in Calais and Baileyville's example, it is a winner across the board. The only thing for us is that with that 6.5, we could only kind of sprinkle it, if you will, amongst all the different communities, and that may not be enough to quote unquote get it done, so to speak. I mean, so that was my only take on that, Mike. I think it is a winning model. I think you guys have something that you very much should be proud of, and I hope that we can find ways to expand it. And I'm hoping that some of that broadband money that may be coming through the state looks at that. And I will say the only problem I have with the state's approach is that sadly the broadband community or the broadband committee that they're setting up has a bunch of CEOs from, AT&T and Verizon and, from the private sector that is going to come up with 100 ways to make their private networks a little bit better. So
Yeah, Danny Snowden loves that.
yeah, I hope we all pay attention to that and make sure that that money doesn't get funneled right back out into a few private pockets. So that's all on that. Thanks, Mike.
So I had mentioned earlier, before everyone was on board, I was chatting with Mike just a little bit and mentioned that we have, as Sunrise County Economic Council has a new staff person coming on in another week or so. Her position is Community and Economic Development Planning. She will be available to work with communities on comprehensive planning, and whatever other pieces that come up that need assistance. So Washington County Council of Governments is not active right now. We're trying to fill some of the hole that's been left behind. This person will also be able to work with towns on helping to do some broadband planning, because with a lot of the funding that's coming down from different places, from what I understand, there really needs to be a community plan in place for communities to even access the funding. So we'll be sending out information. As soon as we really have something more in place, we'll send out some information introducing her and letting you all know that you can contact her for assistance. So that'll be coming right up. And do we have any other questions or comments on the presentations given so far?
We have Millbridge. If a water district is a quasi-municipal organization, could it receive money from the town? And would that be like as a sub-award? Yes.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Yeah, you're exactly correct about that.
Okay, so you wouldn't have to depend on the drinking water program. If the town felt it was eligible purpose, it could come from the town with these funds.
Yes, the water district would still have to spend within the constraints of the program,
Right.
but generally speaking, any municipal water district is going to have eligible projects. I'm confident about that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Any other questions? So Katie, oh yes, sorry, Louis.
Yeah, this is for Neil. When I submitted our budget, I submitted just the budget for the town's actual budget for the town. And it sounded like you said earlier that I should have included probably the county part that we pay and the school part that we pay. Is that correct?
Yes, and that's probably not a huge deal. I would just remark on your first report in April that in fact our real total operating budget is as follows, or not real, but for Treasury's purposes.
So it's something I would do when we do the reporting.
Yes, that would be my recommendation. Or if you want to if you want to double check, you can always email Horn and say, we'd like to change this. And they can make that change on their end.
Thank you.
So Katie, I know that Neil said that towns don't necessarily have to have a sam.gov registration. They don't know for sure yet. But can you just do a quick introduction?
So I know that's what Neil said, but I'm going to say why you should have it. So here, and it's not just for this purpose. So I am the PTAC counselor for Washington County. Normally I help businesses in Washington County get government contracts. And to get a government contract with the federal government, you have to have a sam.gov account. That's what I do. I work with people every day, all day, getting their SAMs done and other things as well. But, so I know the ins and outs of SAM pretty well. The reasons that for most of your towns, a lot of you I'm either working with currently or have worked with in the past. It's not just for federal contracts. If you want any federal government grants, you have to be in sam.gov. So even if it's not used in this particular instant, your towns, your municipalities will probably have an instance where you may need to have that at some point. And I would say, while generally it takes about 3 weeks, that is not always the case. And I would like to say that's usually the rule, but it's not. I have them go anywhere from, I did one Friday morning and they got notified yesterday they were active. I've had some take 7 months. So yes, Neil, that is exactly the look. So also with that, so what I would say is, partly for my own self-preservation, I don't want everyone calling me like with 2 days to go, and if there's an instant that you find out that, oh yes, we have to have sam.gov and we don't have sam.gov, it's not an overnight situation. So I don't want everybody to be waiting till the last second to do it. It doesn't hurt you to have it. It's not hard to get it done. I come over, I help you, I put all the information in, and then we wait to hear back from them. It doesn't hurt you to have it. It's easier to do it earlier rather than later. And I know also Neil mentioned a DUNS number. In order to have a SAM, you have to have a DUNS number. DUNS numbers are easy to get. In a perfect world, they take 30 minutes, but they can take up to a week. However, I do have a special phone number that I can call and get them very quickly, usually by the end of the phone call. So if for some reason you have trouble getting a DUNS number, you can reach out to me for that as well. So I would say if you don't have a SAM account, reach out to me. I'll get you set up. Even if you don't need it for the ARPA funds, you may need it later on. If you haven't renewed it in a while and it's maybe run out because it's something that does happen yearly, they have a new system. September, they implemented a new sam.gov website. It hasn't been as friendly as we would like it to be. So if you need help with that, let me know as well. That's about it.
And Katie's services are free to you, so the town does not have to pay for her to come and help you. So the only downside of registering for a sam.gov account is it'll take a little bit of your time to sit down with Katie and take care of it. So that's it.
It typically takes, if it's a new initial one, we can usually do it in about 45 minutes to an hour. And it's mostly me asking you a couple of questions. If it's a renewal, it doesn't take as long. So.
There. Yeah, so even though we got a late start today, we're doing all right. Ernest, did you have something? You look like you've got something on your mind.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I might remind Mike that Charlotte has a big old aquifer down the railroad tracks that you might want to look into sometime. But I do know that Neil is a walking encyclopedia, and I appreciate that. And Chris touched on something about buildings. The town of Charlotte, Old Town Hall only allows like 15 people in, and we had a town meeting of over 100. We had to move into the fire hall and use the yard. And I was wondering if maybe some money might be used for building a new town hall, because we really need it. We had to move our town office into another town, the town of Pembroke, because of social distancing. And I'd like to see a new town hall in town. I don't know if we could use it for that or not.
Yes, letter of the law would say you could use these money towards a new town hall. You're talking about continuity of government services,
yes,
capacity for the public sector. I think what you might want to consider, though, is there a way to expand this public space for town hall meetings without building an entire new building? So just a thought there, but yes, you could spend those dollars there.
Good. Thank you very much. I really appreciate all the comments that have been made today.
Do we have any other questions or comments? Anyone in Machias? No? No one else has anything? Well, we'll let you go early. You can have 10 minutes back of your morning. So I would like to thank Neil, Chris, Mike, and Katie for talking to us today. Afterwards, I will send out copies of Neil's presentation, as well as contact information for, if you guys don't mind, whoever spoke today. I'll include you on the contact information so that if anyone has follow-up questions, they can get a hold of you. Katie, was there something in Machias?
A few of the people wanted to just say thank you for doing this today.
You're welcome. And thank you all for joining us. Have a great day, and I will see you all at some point in the future, I'm sure.
Yeah.